Hi everybody, this video is called Measures of Macro Performance or Measurements of Macroeconomic Performance. So remember, macroeconomics is looking at the aggregate level. So we're looking at total demand and supply of goods and services across the whole economy. So the combined output of the 65 million people or so that live in our economy. So you've got here, everyone, different things that we want to achieve across our economy. Now, some of you will have been introduced in the past to this acronym at the bottom, Digestive. It's a really, really good thing that we will use not just this year but next year in the course as well, to measure different things that we want to achieve across the economy. So the logic is these are the biggest things that we would like to achieve in our economy at any one time. So digestive, each of these different letters will stand for something different. D stands for development. Economic development is looking at the living standards across the economy. So the ability of people to meet their wants and needs. We'll look at that in a lot more detail in the second year of the course. I stands for inflation. So remember, inflation is measured by a sustained increase in the general price level. So the retail price index and the consumer price index can be used to calculate the rate of inflation across the economy. G stands for growth. Remember, economic growth can be either actual or potential. Actual economic growth is an increase in the value of the real GDP across the economy, whereas potential is measured by an improvement or an increase in the country's factors of production. The E stands for employment. So what we would like across the economy is for the vast majority of people of working age to be employed. Of course, the logic would be the higher the employment rate is, the lower the unemployment rate would be. Employment, or unemployment should I say, so the number of people not working but actively seeking work, is measured through the claimant count, or the ILO, which is the Labour Force Survey measurement of unemployment. Now, S is not something we worry too much about in the first year of the course, but S stands for structure. So we're looking here at different parts of the economy. So a good example right now, because of the coronavirus, some parts of the economy are doing quite well. So the retail sector, for example, bits of it are doing quite well. Supermarkets, etc., places that sell food, doing absolutely fine. But then other parts across the economy are really, really struggling. So the car industry is suffering big time. Hospitality suffering big time. So many big airlines are now talking about massive redundancies, on the verge of bankruptcy. A lot of people like to think about structure in terms of primary, secondary, tertiary and quaternary sectors. So primary sector is looking at agriculture, mining, so farmers, miners, that type of thing. Secondary is the manufacturing sector. So we're looking at the car industry, we're looking at the production of all sorts of different goods, ranging from toasters through to computers. The tertiary sector is the service sector. So we'd include things like retail, hospitality, we'd look at finance, entertainment. So we're looking at invisible earnings or services. The T stands for trade. So if we're looking at trade performance, we look at the value of imports against the value of exports in the economy. And of course they would appear on the UK's current account performance. I stands for inequality. So we're looking here at the gap between the top earners across the economy and the lowest earners. So many people would like, for example, that when the economy grows, the level of inequality to fall. So that gap between the rich and the poor to become smaller over time. F stands for fiscal performance. Now, fiscal is a word that we'll be looking at a lot in a couple of videos' time. When we look at fiscal performance, we're looking at the government's finances. So we look at how much the government spends and we compare it to how much they receive back through tax money. So the logic will be, everyone, across this diagram here, we can represent the vast majority of the different letters of the digestive formula. So what we'll do, let's talk about each one of these in turn for a minute or so. Economic growth, everyone now has just completed an essay looking at this topic here. Remember, growth can be actual and potential, and there are lots and lots of different benefits of economic growth. So, for example, when the economy grows, it will create more job opportunities, with the reason being that if the economy is growing, it means that we're producing a higher level of output. So to produce more output, you're going to need a bigger supply of workers across the economy. So you're going to get a growing demand for labour. What that should do also is to force up wage rates for those same workers too. So workers should benefit through more job opportunities and higher incomes. Now, we should also benefit most firms across the economy as well. If you've got growing demand and growing incomes, then firms should have a growing demand for their goods and services. It helps them earn more revenue, expand profits, and that ultimately means they can invest more into improving the quality of their products, investing into more capital to become more efficient, or it could just simply be so they can pay out more dividends to shareholders, which again would mean that households are becoming wealthier due to that growth in profits of firms. Growth also benefits the government because if more people are working, you've got more people contributing income taxes, national insurance contributions, you've got more consumers buying output, which means you've got more VAT money coming into the government, and because firms are making more profit, there's more corporate and business taxes coming into the government's finances too. And the logic would also be that when the economy grows, it means that there's less need for government spending. You've got a reduction in the demand for welfare benefits from the government. So because you've got less people claiming job seekers allowance, there's less money being paid out by the government. But the data also shows that when we have economic growth, you've got a fall in demand for social services. Crime rates could in theory fall as well, and these things will also save the government a lot of money. It doesn't mean that growth is always good. You know, you've all been looking in your essay answer recently at the problems that when growth is too high, it can create inflation. It can lead to wage price spirals where higher prices will mean that more workers will demand higher wage rates, which push up prices even further. It could lead to a growing demand for imports, so it could worsen trade performance, but also what it can do, it can worsen the environment. Growth means more aeroplanes in the sky, more cars being produced, more people buying output, and all these different things leads to more environmental emissions, which of course is terrible as well. Low unemployment is a really, really important measurement of macro performance. If unemployment is low, then it means there's a high demand for labour. It means people have got incomes to satisfy wants and needs. It means that poverty and living standards should be improving. So poverty rates will fall, living standards will improve. So it's really, really important that you realise the link between growth and unemployment. The higher the rate of economic growth, the lower the unemployment should be. Now what these two should both do is lead to an improvement in what we call economic development. Living standards should improve. If more people are earning because they've got more jobs and higher incomes, it means that living standards can improve. Governments can spend more to improve healthcare, education, housing, transport, and all these things should give people a longer, happier life. You can even argue that when the economy grows, there's more funds available to tackle environmental problems. So logically, you could argue easily enough that growth will actually lead to more funds available to invest into renewable power, sustainable production methods. Now, another really, really important measurement of macro performance is inflation of 2%. Now, when we're operating with 2% inflation or a little bit of leeway, so we normally say 1 towards 3%, we call it price stability. So we would argue at 2% we've got the optimal rate of inflation across the economy. Now, remember, we've got here an increase in the average price level. Now, if inflation was to be too high, what it would do, it would reduce people's real incomes. So you might find that people on lower incomes might struggle to be able to afford basic goods and services. So inflation was high, you can erode the value of people's money. Now on top of that, if we've got really, really high inflation compared to our trading partners, it means that UK output becomes less competitive overseas. It means that our price levels are growing quicker than other countries across the world. this could mean that our economy struggles to export. So export demand from our economy could fall, and that could make export-led growth become more difficult. Now, you also tend to find that when you've got high rates of inflation, you're going to get a growth in other business costs. So workers demand higher rates of pay to compensate for high inflation, so you get more people striking. They try and demand higher rates of pay. Governments have got to pay out more benefits to protect the real value of pensions, incomes of teachers, etc. The cost of running the public sector, schools, hospitals, prisons, will become more expensive, and firms will suffer from something that we call menu costs. So here the logic would be that when you've got higher price levels and price levels are growing quickly, firms have constantly got to update price lists, and those will add extra costs to businesses. Now, a lot of people then say, well, why 2%? If inflation's so bad, why don't we say 0%? Well, the logic is that if inflation's too low, it tends to kill confidence in the economy. Low inflation is normally caused by low demand for goods and services. So when you've got price levels falling up through deflation, or inflation rates are falling rapidly through what we call disinflation, it kills animal spirits in the economy, and that tends to lead to lower confidence, lower consumption, and lower investment taking place as well. If it leads into lower house prices, sounds like a good thing for people wanting to buy a property, but most people own their own home, and they will see the value of their property start to fall due to inflation being too high. Inflation being too low, I beg your pardon. So ideally, price stability would be 2% inflation. If inflation's too high, it's bad. If inflation's too low, that can also be devastating for the economy as well. So just to bring these three together now, high rates of economic growth, if it's a positive output gap, so your actual output exceeding potential output, that high levels of scarcity across the economy will lead to really, really high rates of inflation. So when you've got high growth and very low unemployment, you tend to get really, really high inflation. When you've got a recession, so you've got a negative output gap, actual output below potential output, you tend to get high unemployment, and that is running the risk of deflation across the economy. Remember, deflation will mean that price levels are falling and people delay buying expensive ticket items. So people start to save more, which is a withdrawal from the circular flow. Now, another key macroeconomic target for our economy is to improve our trade performance on the current account. The UK's got one of the world's biggest trade deficits, where the value of imports exceeds the value of our exports. Now remember that importing is not necessarily a bad thing. We have to buy foreign things to meet our wants and needs. Importing gives us a massive choice of different goods from across the world at lower prices. So it's good for our living standards, but when the exports are so low, we have a net withdrawal from the economy. So if the value of imports exceeds the value of exports, aggregate demand is falling. The UK economy, for example, has got lots of structural unemployment because of this. So lots of traditional industries, steel building, for example, coal mining, those industries have left the UK economy, and those people have become unemployed because of it. So the logic would be, if you can improve trade performance and increase your exports, that can create export-led economic growth. It can create more jobs across the economy, which could lead to an improvement in our living standards. Right now, government finances. Every year, through the budget, our government will announce what their plans are to spend across the economy, and that will stretch across current expenditure, which is the day-to-day running the public sector. It will involve capital expenditure, which is money on infrastructure, and it will also involve transfer payments, which is on welfare support, so pensions, job seekers allowance. Taxes can be either direct or indirect. Now, our government runs what we call a budget deficit. So that means year on year, the level of government spending in our economy exceeds the level of taxation. So our government has to fund that through borrowing for what we call bond markets, both domestically and across the world. So in effect, what the government do when they want to borrow, they will create a bond. And then people can buy these bonds across the world, which gives them the right to generate interest, or what we call a yield, year on year. And then at the end of the bond period, the bond will then be repaid back. So whenever our government spends more than what they get back through taxes each year, they've got to create more bonds, which means that government debt is increasing. And the logic will be that when you've got a high budget deficit, it's a big problem. You're building up lots and lots of debt across the economy. And that could mean that future generations have got to be burdened with paying back that debt. So if we can improve our government finances, it should hopefully mean that debt will start to fall, or how much borrowing we do will start to fall, and that will improve our government's finances. Now, two other macroeconomic targets: protect the environment. This is all about trying to become more sustainable as a planet, cut back on plastic, cut back on pollution and waste, cut back on emissions from vehicles. The logic would be that if we can improve the environment, that could lead to an improvement in economic development, so better living standards across the economy. Now, another key macroeconomic target is reduce income inequality. Now, I think it's worth mentioning here the difference between income and wealth. Income is the flows of earnings that people receive. So for most people, their main flow of earnings or income is through their wages by supplying their labour. But these can also be things such as dividends, which are returns on shares that people might own. It could be interest on savings. It could be profits on businesses that people might own. It could be rent on property as well. Wealth is the value of assets that people own. So this could be property, for example. It could be the value of shares, savings in the bank, the car on the drive, jewellery sat around people's homes are all wealth. Now, the logic is that when you have a large gap between high income earners and low income earners, it means that you've got a lot of people in your economy probably in poverty, and that means you've got a big section of society that can't access basic wants and needs. Well, that brings down the development or the living standards of vast majority of people across your economy. But also it's inefficient, because if people are poor, those people find it difficult to fulfil their economic potential. They can't get hold of enough education and skills, and that means they will never get into a job based on their capability. So in this economy, for example, we often talk about trying to boost access to universities for people from poorer backgrounds, what we call deprived backgrounds. It's often about trying to help people get into decent living, so helping people buy their own home or at least rent somewhere that meets good standards. Giving people higher minimum wages can also reduce inequality. Now, you tend to find that we have a conflict sometimes between growth and inequality. So when you have high rates of economic growth, you tend to find that we have something called the trickle-down effect. Now here, in our free market capitalist economy, you tend to find that when economies grow, those that have got lots of wealth and high incomes tend to benefit the most from economic growth. So people that own businesses see profits increase. People that own shares will see the share price increase, so it increases their wealth. But also they're going to get more dividend payments. So the logic will be those that own the assets will see the value of their assets and flows of earnings from them increase massively. And then some of this will then trickle down to people at the bottom, those in poverty, and that will be through more job opportunities, maybe slightly higher rates of pay. Maybe there's more tax money coming in from those wealth and incomes that are being generated, which could raise benefits for low income people. But the logic would be the incomes at the top will go up like that, whereas the incomes of the lower income people might at best do that. So you tend to find that gap opens up between the two. So guys, just to pull all this together, these are our main measurements of macro performance. It doesn't mean we can achieve them all at the same time. It doesn't mean that one's more important than the other. That will often come down to a value judgment, personal belief on what you think the most important target is. But some of them do correlate. So growth tends to create more jobs. Growth tends to lead to an improvement in government finances. But there's no guarantee that growth would lead to a better environment. There's no guarantee that growth would cut inequality. There's a danger that growth can create high inflation. Growth can also lead to a growing demand for imports, which would worsen trade performance. So it's about trying to strike a balancing act, really, trying to achieve as many targets as we can. So overall, everyone, what I would say is remember digestive. Remember, these are our key measurements of macro performance. Okay, cheers everyone, thank you.